Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 89. These are issues that anyone who's doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 89, the top 3 issues are the identity of Ethan the Ezrahite in the superscription, the text and meaning of verse 38, and the text and meaning of verse 51, and the question of what the psalmist is carrying in his bosom. The first exegetical issue for Psalm 89 is in the superscription, the identity of Ethan the Ezrahite. So Psalm 89 begins with a superscription, a maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite. And the Hebrew here is maskil le'etan ha'ezrahi. The question is, who is Etan ha'ezrahi? Who is Ethan the Ezrahite? And how exactly does he relate to Psalm 89? Now, this might seem like a question that doesn't have a big impact on how we interpret or translate the psalm, but as we'll see, it does. And actually, working through this issue brings us to the heart of the psalm's structure and the history of its composition. By working through this issue, we can come to a deeper understanding and appreciation of the psalm. So we'll ask the question again, who was this Ethan the Ezrahite? Well, the first thing we can observe is that Ethan, whoever he is, appears to be the author of this psalm. In the superscription, his name is prefixed with a lamed preposition, le'etan ha'ezrahi, and as we've argued elsewhere, this probably indicates authorship. So Ethan is a poet, and he's the poet primarily responsible for Psalm 89. And the second thing we can observe is that Ethan is associated with another poet named Heman. So in the previous psalm, Psalm 88, the superscription says a maskil, but this time the psalm is attributed to Heman the Ezrahite. So we have a pair of figures, Ethan and Heman. Both are poets, both are called Ezrahites, and their poems are put right next to each other in the Psalter, Psalm 88, Psalm 89. And so we know just by looking at Psalm 89 and its context that Ethan was a poet and that he was associated with another poet, someone named Heman. Now with this information, we can go to the book of Chronicles to learn more. In 1 Chronicles 6, we read that King David appointed, among others, a certain Heman and a certain Ethan to be in charge of music in the temple or the tabernacle. The passage says, "These are the men whom David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark rested there. They ministered with song before the tabernacle of the tent of meeting until Solomon built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, and they performed their service according to their order. These are the men who served, and their sons. Of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman the singer, and his brother Asaph, who stood on his right hand. On the left hand were their brothers, the sons of Merari, Ethan, the son of Kishi, son of Levi." So here we learn that Ethan and Heman were Levites, who lived in the time of King David and helped lead the music in the house of the Lord. Based on what we've seen so far, it seems very likely that the Ethan here in Chronicles, the Levite singer, is the same Ethan in Psalm 89:1, the Ethan who wrote primarily Psalm 89. And this becomes even more likely when we realize that many psalms in the Psalter were written by Levites. The sons of Korah were Levites. Asaph was a Levite, and Moses was a Levite. So when a psalm is attributed to someone other than David, it's usually attributed to a Levite. And so it makes perfect sense that Ethan in Psalm 89 was the Levite musician that we read about in Chronicles living in the time of King David. But there are 2 problems with this view. The first problem involves the word Ezrahite. So if Ethan was a Levite, what does it mean that he was an Ezrahite? The name Ethan the Ezrahite, exactly as it appears in Psalm 89, actually occurs in another passage in 1 Kings chapter 5. In English, this is chapter 4. And the passage says, "Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, Etan ha'ezrahi." Wiser than Heman, Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. So in this passage, notice that we have Ethan the Ezrahite, just like in Psalm 89, and he's associated with Heman. So surely this is the same Ethan and Heman from Psalms 88 and 89, the same Ethan and Heman from Chronicles, the Levite singers who lived in the generation before Solomon. And apparently, according to this passage, they were renowned for their wisdom, as well as for their musical abilities. According to this passage in 1 Kings, they were also sons of Mahol, together with Calcol and Darda. Now this could mean that their father was named Mahol, they're literally sons of Mahol, but this seems unlikely because, according to Chronicles, as we saw, Ethan and Heman come from different Levitical families, and the father of Ethan was a Levite named Kishi. So it's more likely that Mahol in 1 Kings isn't a person's name, but a group or a guild. As the Hebrew dictionary Halot suggests, the phrase sons of Mahol could mean members of a guild of musicians. And this makes sense of what we know about Ethan and Heman. But we still don't know what Ezrahite means. And this is where the situation starts to get confusing. Because the genealogy in 1 Chronicles 2 lists these same four men that we saw in the 1 Kings passage, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, as sons of Zerach, the son of Judah. So 1 Chronicles 2:6 says, the sons of Zerach, V'nei Zerach, Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Darda. 5 in all. So here we find the answer to what Ezrahite means. According to the chronicler, it indicates someone who belongs to the clan of Zerach. And you can hear and see how the word Ezrahi sounds and looks like the name Zerach. The yod at the end of Ha-Ezrahi is common with people groups, and the aleph at the beginning was probably added for the sake of pronunciation, so that the word doesn't begin with a cluster of consonants. But now we have what looks like a contradiction. 1 Chronicles 2 identifies Ethan as a son of Zerach from the tribe of Judah, who lived long before the time of David. And 1 Chronicles 6 identifies him as a Levite during the time of David. But when we look closer, we see that this isn't a real contradiction. There's a scholar named James Bijon who's done a lot of work on biblical genealogies, and he points out that biblical genealogies are not strictly biological. Instead, they can organize and reorganize themselves based on changes in geography and politics. And so it's possible, for example, for a Levite to be identified as a Judahite or an Ephraimite based on where he lives. And so to give an example, in Judges 17:7, we read about a young man of Bethlehem in Judah of the family of Judah who was a Levite. And the book of Samuel begins by referring to Elkanah the Levite as an Ephraimite because that's where he lived. In the same way, Ethan and Heman, even though they were Levites, could be identified as Zerahites or Ezrahites based on where they lived or where they came from or what clan they were associated with. So all of the biblical evidence up to this point supports the view that Ethan the Ezrahite is the Levitical singer from the time of David. But now this brings us to another, more serious problem with this view. And it's this problem that brings us to the heart of the psalm and its structure. If Ethan the Ezrahite, the Levite singer, wrote Psalm 89, then how do we make sense of the fact that much of Psalm 89 assumes a situation well after David's kingship, a situation in which David's dynasty was under serious threat? Beginning in verse 39, we read, "But you have rejected and refused. You have become furious with your anointed one. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have thrown his crown down to the ground as something profane. You have breached all his walls. You have made his strongholds a ruin." How does this fit with anything from the time of David or from the time of Solomon? It seems to assume a later situation. Some have suggested the 8th century Syro-Ephraimite conflict. Others have suggested the 6th century destruction of the Jerusalem temple. But both of these events took place centuries after David and Ethan were alive. So how do we make sense of the fact that this psalm bears Ethan's name, presumably as the author, when much of the psalm seems to have been written long after he was alive? Well, some have argued that Ethan's not really the author. Others have argued that Ethan, he was the author, but he was speaking prophetically about the distant future. Our view is that Ethan didn't write the whole psalm. Instead, he only wrote verses 1 through 38, or verses 2 through 38 if you leave out the superscription. And these first 38 verses are a celebration of God's covenant with David, and it would make perfect sense coming from one of David's contemporaries. But then in verse 39, the verse which we started reading a moment ago, at verse 39 there is a strong poetic, thematic, and emotional break in the discourse. And you can see our poetic structure visual for more information about this break. And given this strong break, it's plausible that verses 39 through the end of the psalm come from a different hand, that they were written at a later point in time, perhaps as a response to the original psalm, the first 38 verses. Now, this might seem speculative, but there's actually evidence in the text for this reconstruction. Not only does it account for the shift within Psalm 89 itself, but it also accounts for the superscription of Psalm 88. So Psalm 88 is unique in that it has two superscriptions. The first one says, a song, a psalm by the sons of Korah. And then there's a second one that says, for the director, about illness, for self-affliction, a maskil by Heman the Ezrahite. And we would argue that the best way to explain this double superscription is that the first superscription over Psalm 88 doesn't stand over Psalm 88 individually, but over Psalms 88 and 89 as a unit. And so Psalm 89 actually has two superscriptions, which indicate two authors, Ethan the Ezrahite and the sons of Korah. And we would suggest that Ethan the Ezrahite wrote Psalm 89, 1 through 38, and then the sons of Korah, as specified by the first superscription in Psalm 88, wrote the rest of Psalm 89, verses 39 through 53, and that they wrote it as a response to the original psalm and as a conclusion to Psalms 88 and 89 as a unit. So who was Ethan the Ezrahite? He was a Levitical singer in the time of David, who was associated historically and geographically with the clan of Zerach in the tribe of Judah, and he wrote the first major part of Psalm 89. And then the second major part, beginning in verse 39, is a response to Ethan's original poem, and it was written by the Korahites. And I would encourage you to check out our Poetics layer, where we further explore what this means for understanding the psalm as a poem. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation, this reconstruction, a C rating. The second issue in Psalm 89 is at the end of verse 38, which, according to the conclusion to the previous issue, is the very end of the original poem that Ethan wrote. And we can see just how difficult this verse is when we look at the different ways it's been translated. The NIV says, "It will be established forever." That is talking about David's throne. "It will be established forever like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky." One German translation, translated here into English, says, "Like the moon, it will stand firm forever. The witness in the clouds is faithful." The NET says, "It will remain stable like the moon. His throne will endure like the skies." The NEB, lastly, says, "It shall be sure forever as the moon's return, faithful so long as the skies remain." Notice that the first two translations mention a witness that is faithful. But then these first two translations disagree on the syntax. The NIV has "the faithful witness in the sky," describing the moon in the previous line. And the Elberfelder translation has "the witness is faithful." So it analyzes this line as its own complete clause, and it leaves open the question of who the witness is. It might be the moon, but it could be something or someone else. And then the NET and the NEB are completely different. Neither of these even mention a witness. Instead, the NET has "throne," and the NEB has "so long as remain." And we don't really have time in this video to evaluate all of these different views in detail. For that, you can see our website linked in the description below. But suffice it to say here that the NEB is based on an emendation of the Hebrew text. And the NET, the NET, it understands the word for witness as actually a different word that means throne, based on a parallel in Ugaritic. But we prefer to side with the majority of modern translations, which mention a witness. And all of the ancient versions understood this word to mean witness. And witness makes good sense in the context. Verse 38 belongs to the larger unit of verses 20 through 38. And these verses are describing the covenant that God made with David. And then these verses, this covenant section of the psalm, concludes with an oath in verses 36, 37, and 38. So verse 36 introduces the oath. "Once and for all, I swear an oath by my holiness." And then the oath goes until verse 38, which is where it concludes. Verse 38 is the verse that we're looking at. And it makes sense that a covenant sealed by an oath would conclude by mentioning a witness. So verse 38 is probably describing a witness to the covenant, a witness to this oath. But the question still remains, who or what is this witness? The NIV identifies it as the moon, while the Elberfelder translation leaves the issue open. Some think that the witness is the Lord himself. Others think that the witness is David's throne. In the end, the identity of the witness depends largely on how we analyze the syntax. The NIV translates verse 38 as the moon, the faithful witness in the sky. And according to this interpretation, the second line is a noun phrase in apposition to the moon in the first line. And according to this interpretation of the syntax, there's no question about the witness. It is unambiguously the moon, the faithful witness in the sky. But this interpretation of the syntax, although it's popular among English translations, is really not grammatically correct in Hebrew. The Hebrew text says, K'yareach yikon olam ve'ed bashachak ne'aman selah. So the first line, K'yareach yikon olam, the first line is pretty clear syntactically. Like the moon, that is David's throne, like the moon, David's throne will be established forever. But then it's the second line that gives us trouble. Ve'ed bashachak ne'aman. This is what the NIV and so many other modern translations translate as the faithful witness in the sky. The first word, aid, means witness, and the third word, ne'aman, means faithful. And the word in between, bashachak, is what's being translated as in the sky. But there are two serious problems with this interpretation of the syntax. The first is the word order. The adjective translated faithful, ne'aman, is separated from the noun witness, aid. In between them is the phrase in the sky, bashachak. But according to the way Hebrew grammar works, the adjective needs to be right next to the noun it modifies. And so for the faithful witness interpretation to work, the text would have to say aid ne'aman bashachak. But that's not what it says. We have instead aid bashachak ne'aman. The second problem with this traditional interpretation of the syntax is the vav conjunction at the beginning of aid, aid. So notice that the NIV doesn't directly translate the vav. We might expect it to say, like the moon and the witness, aid. Instead, the NIV interprets the vav as introducing a kind of apposition, the moon, that is, the witness. Now, this is possible, but it's still somewhat unusual, and together with the more serious word order problem, it suggests that this interpretation of the syntax is on the wrong track. The Elberfelder translation gives a more likely interpretation of the syntax. The witness in the clouds is faithful. Now, according to this view, the word faithful, ne'aman, is not an adjectival modifying witness, the faithful witness, but is instead the predicate complement of the clause. The witness is faithful. And this view makes more sense grammatically. It makes sense of the word order and it accounts for the vav, but it runs up against the poetic structure of the psalm. The previous verse, verse 37, has a clear AB structure with elision of the verb in the second half. His offspring will be forever, and his throne will be like the sun before me. And then verse 38 appears to continue the semantic rhythm with its own AB pattern. Like the moon, it will be established forever, and like a witness in the sky, it will be enduring. Now, the word faithful in the NIV can also mean enduring, and it's parallel here to the word established in the A line. And there are other cases of these two words occurring together in parallel. So some scholars want to read the end of verse 38 as an independent unit, standing outside the previous lines. And the witness in the clouds is faithful. But this, in our view, this disregards the poetic pattern in verses 37 through 38 and the poetic parallel between established and enduring. And if we read verse 38 in this way as continuing the pattern, the AB pattern, then the syntax and meaning of the verse become clear. The first half of verse 38 says that David's throne will be established forever like the moon, and then the second half says that it will be enduring like a witness in the sky. Given the poetic parallelism, the word like, the preposition k in Hebrew, is probably elided from the first line. If this interpretation of the syntax is right, then it helps us to identify the witness. The word witness is parallel to the word moon, just as the word enduring is parallel to the word established. And so the witness is probably the moon. And so in the end, our preferred interpretation is similar to the NIV's translation, which identifies the witness as the moon, the faithful witness. We've just arrived at this conclusion in a different way, in a way that we would argue better accounts for the grammar and the poetic structure. Identifying the moon as the witness also makes sense in the wider biblical and ancient Near Eastern context. In Deuteronomy, for example, Moses calls heaven and earth as a witness to God's covenant with Israel. And Hittite treaties from the late Bronze Age will often give a list of witnesses to the treaty, including the sun god, and the moon god. And the moon god is even called the Lord of the Oath. So there's one treaty, for example, that says, "Now regarding the fact that I have prepared this treaty tablet for you, so now on this same occasion the 1,000 gods into the council are summoned. They shall hear and be witnesses." And it mentions the moon god, king of the oath. Of course, Psalm 89 is not acknowledging the moon as a god, but it does seem to be playing with what was a standard literary convention and adapting it to an Israelite context. The moon isn't a god, but it is a witness to God's covenant faithfulness. And so it stands as a reminder, as evidence, as a witness that God will keep his oath to David. As long as the moon continues, then God's covenant with David will continue, because it's the same covenant loyalty that upholds the moon, that upholds the covenant with David. And this is exactly the logic of a passage in Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says: "If you can break my covenant with the day and my covenant with the night, so that day and night no longer come at their appointed time, then my covenant with David my servant can be broken, and David will no longer have a descendant to reign on his throne." So in conclusion, we've translated verse 38 as, "Like the moon, it will be established forever. And like a witness in the sky, it will be reliable," or enduring. In other words, we see verse 38 as having an AB structure with elision in the B line. And so verse 38 continues the poetic pattern of verse 37. And this pattern means that the witness in verse 38 is to be identified with the moon. We give this interpretation a C rating. The third issue in Psalm 89 is the text and meaning of verse 51. Verse 51 has two lines. The first line says in Hebrew, "Zochor Adonai cherpat vadecha." Remember, Lord, the reproach of your servants. And for the most part, this first line is fairly straightforward. There is a question of whether servants should be singular or plural, your servant or your servants. But other than that, this first line is without serious problems, and we take the servants plural view, your servants. The second line is where our exegetical issue will focus. Se'eti v'cheki kol rabim amim. According to the King James Version, this second line says, "Remember how I do bear in my bosom the reproach of all the mighty people." And the italics in the King James Version mean that the translators have supplied that part to the text. In Hebrew, there's no direct equivalent to the phrase, "the reproach of." The text literally just says, "bear in my bosom all the mighty people." But the KJV translators argue that the phrase, "the reproach of," is implied or elided from the previous clause. The word cherpat in the first line means the reproach of. Other translations argue that there is no elision. So for example, a French translation, the NBS translation here in English, says, "Remember that I carry in my bosom the whole multitude of peoples." And so where the King James Version has the psalmist carrying the reproach of the peoples, this translation has the psalmist carrying the people themselves. And you'll notice there's also a question of whether the verse is talking about a multitude of people or mighty people, whether the description is of the vastness of the peoples. You'll also notice that there's a question of whether the verse is talking about a multitude of peoples or mighty people, whether the description of the vastness of the people is qualitative or quantitative. But the main issue is this issue of elision, and whether the psalmist is carrying the peoples or their reproach. Both of these translations, the KJV and the NBS, reflect the same Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, which says, Se'eti v'cheki kol rabim amim. The first two words, Se'eti v'cheki, mean my carrying, Se'eti, in my bosom, v'cheki. And this phrase is interpreted as the object of an implied verb remember, which would be implied from the previous line. Remember my carrying. Remember that, or how I carry in my bosom. And by the way, carrying something in your bosom just means holding it up to your chest, maybe inside the fold of your robe. But then these translations disagree on the second half of the line. Kol rabim amim. The NBS thinks that kol rabim amim is the object of the verb carry. Remember that I carry in my bosom the whole multitude of peoples. What would this mean, to carry many peoples, to carry a multitude of peoples in your bosom? Well, there's a similar expression in the book of Numbers where Moses says that I conceive all this people, that I give them birth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, sa'ehu v'chekecha, as a nurse carries a nursing child. So in this passage in Numbers, we have an image of a leader carrying a people in his bosom, which means taking care of them in the way that a nurse takes care of a child. Now, this could make sense in the context of Psalm 89 if the speaker here is the king, a king who, like Moses, is responsible for the nation. He carries in his bosom a great multitude of people. And so here he asks God to remember this great responsibility that he has and to rescue him, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of all the people that he's caring for. Well, that's one way to read the text, and it would seem to be a straightforward reading of the text without any elision. But there are at least two issues with this interpretation. First, it seems strange that the Davidic king would refer to the nation under his care as all the many peoples, plural. Usually the word peoples, plural, refers to Gentile nations. And especially if you're talking about all the many peoples, this can't refer just to Israel. It has to refer to multiple nations or multiple people groups. And it doesn't make sense to say that the Davidic king cares for these many peoples in the same way that Moses cared for the Israelites who came out of Egypt. And then, in addition to the semantic problem, there's a syntactic problem with this view. The expression kol rabim amim is syntactically unusual. It's very rare for kol, meaning all, and rabim, meaning many, to modify the same word, all many peoples. Now, there is at least one example in Ezekiel where you have these two modifiers together, kol goyim rabim, all the many peoples, or perhaps all the great peoples. But notice here in Ezekiel that the word order is slightly different. The adjective rabim follows the noun that it modifies, whereas in Psalm 89 it precedes the noun. Now, there are other examples where the adjective rabim precedes the noun it modifies, so this isn't a critical issue, but when you consider the position of rabim along with the issue of kol rabim together, along with the general semantic issue, you start to wonder if there isn't a better solution. Well, the KJV tries to solve the problem, at least the semantic problem, by eliding the word reproach from the previous clause. Remember how I do bear in my bosom the reproach of all the mighty people. Now, this interpretation makes sense. Carrying reproach in your bosom makes sense in the context, and it's also an attested figure of speech. Psalm 79:12 says, again according to the KJV, "And render unto our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their reproach, wherewith they have reproached thee, O Lord." Here we have the same word for bosom, the same word for reproach, and the same image of someone carrying or receiving reproach in their bosom. But even though the KJV resolves the semantic issue, its translation makes sense, it doesn't resolve the syntactic issue. There are still the minor problems we mentioned earlier with the phrase kol rabim amim. But then the KJV also introduces a more serious syntactic problem. Elision in Hebrew poetry, that's where a constituent from one line is implied in or elided in the following line, is very common. But it's usually the elision of a verb. Elision of noun phrases, like reproach, is rare. And it's even more rare to have the first half of a construct chain elided or supplied to create a new construct chain in the B line, which is what the KJV assumes here with the elision of cherpat. We're not aware of any other examples of this kind of elision. Maybe it's possible, but it would seem unusual. So the KJV does a good job of making sense of the line, but it involves a strained interpretation of the syntax in doing so. And so this brings us to a third option. The NRSV says, "Remember how I bear in my bosom the insults of the peoples." Now, this translation involves an emendation to the Masoretic text. Instead of Kol Rabim Amim, this translation reads Kol Rive Me Amim, or something similar. This reading, Kol Rive Me Amim, involves the same consonantal text as the Masoretic text, but with different vowels and a different division of words. So instead of rabim, it has rive me. The word rive is a plural construct from the noun riv, which the NRSV has translated here as insults. And this word would fit well in the context. In terms of parallelism, the word riv belongs to the same semantic domain as the word reproach, cherpa. And there's at least one more example of these two words as a poetic parallel. And in terms of the wider context, it would make sense to say that all of the nations are insulting or perhaps indicting, bringing charges against Israel, claiming that their God has abandoned them. And so the psalmist, here representing the whole people, is carrying the weight of these insults in his bosom. He's carrying them close to his heart. It's also worth noting that we find a similar phrase elsewhere. Psalm 18:44 says, "You have delivered me from the attacks of the people." And the Hebrew phrase here is merive am, very similar to what we have in the amended text in Psalm 89. And so this interpretation, represented by the NRSV, makes sense semantically. It resolves all of the syntactic problems that we saw in the other two translation options. And this reading, even though it disagrees with the Masoretic text, has support from some of the ancient versions. The Greek translation by Aquila, for example, has all the injustices of the peoples. And Jerome's Hebrew-based Latin translation says all the iniquities of the peoples. So apparently, some early Hebrew manuscripts on which these translations were based read the text in the way that the NRSV is reading it, with the noun riv instead of the adjective rabim. The only potential problem with this interpretation is the mem, which we've interpreted as a preposition, me amim. Our interpretation would mean that we have a word in construct, rive, followed by a prepositional phrase, me amim. And this is somewhat unusual. You would normally expect rive amim without any preposition. But there are numerous examples of prepositional phrases embedded within construct chains like what we're proposing here. And to give just one example, Ezekiel 13:2 mentions those who prophesy from their own hearts, nevi'e milibam. So the noun prophets is in construct, nevi'e, and the noun to which it is in construct is prefixed with a min preposition, milibam. This is the exact same construction that we have in Psalm 89:51 according to our amended text. In conclusion, then, we prefer to interpret Psalm 89:51 along with the NRSV and other translations, ancient and modern, as saying, "Remember how I carry in my bosom all the insults of the peoples." And we give this interpretation a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The first issue relates directly to the superscription and how we ought to identify Ethan the Ezrahite. But this first issue also takes us into the heart of the psalm's structure and history. Psalm 89 seems to have been written in two main stages. Ethan wrote the first part through verse 38 as a celebration of God's covenant with David, and then the second part, beginning in verse 39, seems to have been written later as a response to the first part, as a lament to the apparent end of God's covenant with David, and as an appeal for God to remember his promises. The second issue took us to the conclusion of this first part, to verse 38. Here the Lord swears an oath that David's throne will be established like the moon, and will be enduring like the witness in heaven. The phrase witness in heaven, or witness in the sky, refers to the moon in the parallel line, but it specifies the moon's role as a witness to God's covenant loyalty. As long as the moon continues, so David's kingdom will continue, because the same God who upholds his covenant with the day and with the night, with the sun and with the moon, promises to be faithful to David. And then the last issue brings us to the end of the psalm, where it seems like, despite God's promises, the covenant with David has failed. And the psalmist, speaking on behalf of the people, asks God to remember how they are scorned, to remember how they carry in their bosom all the insults of the peoples. All the surrounding nations are mocking them and claiming that their God has abandoned them. And so the psalm ends with a lament and a plea for the Lord to remember. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 89, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All our videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at Scriptura.org to learn more.